Hello, so now we're going to have a look at evaluating the effectiveness of a maximum price. So as you can see, we've got our maximum price diagram here, quite clear with the maximum price set below the market equilibrium in order for the maximum price to be effective. However, we can now start to look at particular issues with regards to a maximum price and whether or not it will be effective in correcting any market failures. Well, first of all, let's start with quite a basic point with regards to the maximum price. The maximum price may lead to a reduction in quality, and the reduction in quality of particular products may come due to obviously the lower price, and therefore firms are looking in order to save costs in order to be profitable. So quality of the products may fall, firms lower costs to remain profitable, and as a result the quality falls. So the lower cost materials to remain profitable for firms may lead to a reduction in the quality of the particular products. Okay, so that's one evaluative point that we can mention. A second evaluative point that we may wish to mention is that the maximum price is obviously going to lead to a reduction in quantity supplied. Okay, because as we see in our diagram, the quantity supplied has fallen from Q to Q1. And as a result, certain individuals within society will not be able to consume products. May not be able to consume. And if certain individuals are able to consume or have access to a particular product, let's say, for example, housing, that therefore may lead to a rise in inequality. So, for example, if we put a maximum price on rent, for example, it may mean that landlords do not put their properties up to be let out, and as a result, we may see increases in homelessness. Obviously, therefore, represents a rise in inequality because less housing is available to be rented out due to the rent controls being put in place, and therefore more people will be homeless because there's no houses for them to live in or rent out. And therefore the rise in inequality may occur. Similar to the point mentioned with regards to a fall in the quantity supplied, we can refer to the excess demand that we see. So excess demand, as we see from our diagram, is obviously the difference between Q2 and Q1. So Q2 minus Q1 gives us our excess demand, and as a result of the excess demand, this may lead to the rise of black markets. And obviously these black markets occurring are an example of government failure. So how these black markets would work? Well, obviously certain people aren't going to be able to consume the product because obviously the quantity supplied has now fallen. Okay, and therefore due to this excess demand, we may see black markets occurring where the product is being sold on the black market for a higher price, and therefore that may lead to a rise in inequality. So black markets, consumers want to consume the product, and as a result are prepared to pay a higher price, and as a result of that higher price, again, that's going to lead to a rise in inequality. So just to reiterate that point, there's excess demand within the market due to the maximum price. Consumers are willing and able to buy a quantity of Q2. However, suppliers are only willing and able to sell a quantity of Q1. Therefore, there is excess demand, and this may lead to rise in black markets, which is an example of a government failure. Consumers want to consume the product, and therefore, in order to consume the product, they may be prepared to pay a higher price. And as a result, by paying that higher price, that is going to lead to a rise in inequality. So another really good point to mention with regards to maximum pricing. Obviously, the impact of a maximum price is going to depend on where the maximum price is set at. So, what is the maximum price? So, obviously, we need to consider the lower the maximum price, we should see a greater increase in quantity demanded. However, we would see a larger or a greater decrease in quantity supplied, and overall there'd be a larger excess demand to be greater excess demand. Okay, so the extent of the maximum price and how effective it is may depend on where the maximum price is set, but it still remains the issue of the excess demand occurring. Okay, the main really technical evaluative point that we want to be mentioning with regards to price elasticity, with regards to maximum pricing, is the price elasticity of supply, because the price elasticity of supply is really going to determine whether the maximum price is going to be effective or not. So, mention this point up here. So, depends on PES, so the price elasticity of supply. So let's first of all have a look with regards to something, the PES being inelastic. So the PES, so the price elasticity of supply, is inelastic. Let's have a look at the impact of that. And of course, we're going to use a diagram to support our evaluation here. So we construct our diagram, price, quantity. Now we're looking for a really steep price elasticity of supply curve. So make it nice and steep. S, and then we can just draw a downward sloping demand curve. And we can add in our maximum price. Of course, remember to set it below the market equilibrium. So maximum price, P max, we'll put our P in there, we'll draw it across to our original equilibrium, and there we go. So we've got Q, we've got Q1, and we've got Q2. So let's just explain what's going on here. So if the price elasticity of supply is inelastic, we see a reduction in the price from P to P max. But what we see with regards to this that is important is that the increase in quantity demanded is significant, but the reduction in quantity supply is a very small decrease in the quantity supplied. There's only a fall of Q to Q1. So let's just put this into words. What is happening here? So the reduction in P to P, from P to P max, leads to a less than proportional decrease in the quantity supplied. the reduction in quantity supplied is less than proportional. So what that means is that actually the majority of people are still going to be able to consume the product because the amount supplied is remaining relatively stable. So let's have a look if the price elasticity of supply was elastic. So if PES was elastic, what we would see is, again, we draw a diagram to talk through the point that we're making. Right, and now we're looking to make our supply curve as shallow as possible. So we draw a supply curve nice and shallow. We draw a demand curve in there. We'll put our max price in there as well. So we'll label that D. We'll label that maximum price. And obviously we can label that Q, label that P. We'll label this bit as P and Q. We label that as Q1, we label that as Q2, and we label that as P max. So obviously if the price elasticity of supply is elastic, a decrease in price from P to P max leads to a more than proportional decrease in quantity supplied. More than proportional decrease in quantity supplied from Q to Q1. So all we need to do now is we just need to sum up what does that mean. So really what we want, if we're going to introduce a maximum price, what we want to happen is we want to ensure that the price elasticity of supply is inelastic in order to ensure that supply remains as stable as possible in order to ensure that consumers are still able to consume the products. So let's just put a comment about that. So we'll just make that comment here. PES needs to be inelastic to ensure stable quantity supplied so consumers can still consume the product at the lower price, and that lower price obviously being P max. So in order for the price, for a maximum price to be effective, we kind of want the price elasticity of demand to be inelastic, because it means that quantity supplied would remain relatively stable, so consumers can still consume the product. Obviously, there is still going to be excess demand, but we want to if the product is price elasticity of supply is inelastic, that should help to maintain the supply, because it's much harder for producers to switch to reallocate their resources to somewhere else. So obviously the price elasticity of supply is inelastic. It's much harder for producers. So it's much harder for producers when the price elasticity of supply is inelastic to reallocate their resources to producing another product. So therefore the supply of that particular product is going to remain relatively stable, and that ensures that consumers are therefore able to buy the product. Okay, and then the final comment that we're going to make with regards to evaluating a maximum price is the point with regards to a maximum price is really only going to be effective if we can actually maybe increase the supply of the product at the same time. So obviously we've seen throughout the maximum price, we've got the issue of excess demand, and really there's a lack of supply of the products, and obviously that's going to be well, that's what we'd expect, because obviously the lower price and as a result of the profit motive, firms aren't going to want to sell their product at that lower price. So a maximum price is only really going to be effective if we can increase supply at the same time. So just a comment here, we'll just put right at the very top of the page, final comment. We need to look to increase supply at the same time, and by doing so, that should help to alleviate the excess demand. Increase supply at the same time, and therefore should reduce the excess. The excess demand. I think I may have said excess supply moments ago. So just to reiterate, we want to increase the supply at the same time, and therefore that should reduce the excess demand, because we're now getting a greater supply. So what the government may wish to consider is they may wish to consider implementing a subsidy. So if we particularly think about the housing market, obviously a maximum price would ensure that people should be able to rent property, and therefore that should hopefully reduce homelessness. But again, by introducing that maximum price, as we see on our diagram, it creates excess demand. So only really going to effectively solve the problem of a housing shortage if we actually increase the supply, because obviously increasing the supply should actually, if we did that, if we drew it on our diagram, we would see that, for example, if we did increase the supply, we would see that we could add a supply curve in there, for example. We go from S to S1, and actually if we introduced a new quantity, that would be Q3, let's say, we can see that the excess demand now is much smaller. That excess demand is only Q2 minus Q3. So you can see that the excess demand has decreased from Q2 minus Q1 to Q2 minus Q3. So what we can see here, just going back to the point, if we increase supply at the same time, therefore that should reduce the excess demand. As we've just demonstrated on our diagram here, that the excess demand would have reduced from Q2 to Q1. That was originally what the excess demand was, to Q2 minus Q3. So Q2 minus Q1 to Q2 minus Q3. So we can see the excess demand has reduced, and that would, so increasing the supply is imperative to trying to reduce the excess demand, which is caused by a maximum price. So we've got plenty of points to talk about when we criticise the effectiveness of a maximum price.